Okay. Welcome, AP World History students, to Chapter 37. This is the Cold War. We're almost through here, so stay strong. We'll look at the follow-up, what happens to the world following the greatest conflict in human history, World War II. Well, one of the main things that you have to know is that after World War II, America is not going to go back into isolationism. I hope you're writing this down. Instead, they're going to become interventionist. They're going to make sure that something like World War II never happens again. To do this, they get on board with the creation of the United Nations in 1945. You need to know that. In the United Nations, there's 5 permanent Security Council members, which is America, Great Britain, France, who you should know are going to vote with each other, and then the Soviet Union, who's communist, and China, who becomes communist in 1949. So those are the 5 permanents. A big reason that the Cold War begins is that there are many different reasons, but one of the reasons is that Stalin is he wants a buffer zone between Russia and Germany and Western Europe as well. And so he takes control basically of these countries in Eastern Europe. Well, America and Britain say, okay, I guess we understand that, but you have to allow Poland and Eastern Europe to have free elections. And Stalin says he'll do that, but Stalin's lying. And all these Eastern European countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, you see them down there, they're going to become communist-controlled puppet dictatorships that answer to Joseph Stalin. So we issue something that you really need to know, very important, the Truman Doctrine in 1947. And basically, we view the world as being divided into free and enslaved states. Free meaning democracy-controlled countries, and enslaved states being those who are communist, who answer to Russia. So the Truman Doctrine says the United States of America will help any country that needs help against communism, either to keep communism from taking over, or if they are controlled by communism and they want out of communism but can't get out. This is part of a foreign policy. You also need to know it's there's a couple of catchphrases in World War or in the Cold War, and this is one of them: containment. Not that we go to war with Russia. Nobody wants war. We're tired of war, but that we contain communism. Like a virus, we keep it from spreading across the globe. The end goal of communism being world domination. So to help do this, we issue another very important term called the Marshall Plan. It's named after our U.S. Secretary of State. It's $13 billion that we send to Europe, especially Western Europe. Now, we were offering it to Europe, but only the Western European countries out of Stalin's control took money. Stalin wouldn't let the Eastern European countries take money, because when you take somebody's money, they get strings attached to you. They get influence over you, and he doesn't want that. So our $13 billion is going to help very quickly rebuild Britain and France, even Italy. Italy partakes of the Marshall Plan and helps rebuild itself very quickly. So Western Europe is going to be pretty nice. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe is going to continue to be run down. Understand that these two great powers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, have different ideologies. And they're basically arguing over which way of life is better, communist or democracy. In person, it's certain in this time period, it certainly seems like democracy and capitalism has the leg up on communism and socialism, their economic system. The Soviets established the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, the Comecon. That's kind of their version of the Marshall Plan. Not going to be quite as effective because simply they're not as powerful as the United States is. And the United States came out of World War II. They didn't lose a single city. They didn't have any factories blown up, no infrastructure destroyed, and they didn't lose 20 million people like the Russians did. So they come out of World War II sitting pretty. America doesn't trust the Soviets, neither do the British or the French, many other Western European countries. So we get together in another thing you must know called NATO. That stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's done in 1949, and it's a collective defense. You need to write this. An attack against one is an attack against all. The Soviet Union certainly sees that as a threat. They feel as though the capitalist countries are ganging up on them. The democratically controlled countries are ganging up on them. So a few years later, they issue their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. Um, it consists of 7 communist European countries. It's not a very impressive list of countries, whereas NATO had 11 countries, including Canada, Britain, France. So it was a much more impressive list than what the Russians came up with. Another huge contested point of the Cold War was what's going to happen in Germany. So Germany's this big bad monster that the Soviets are not happy with. They've been attacked twice by Germany, losing 7 million in World War I, 20 million in World War II. They don't want to ever be attacked again. They don't want to ever suffer at the hands of Germany again. They want to basically obliterate Germany. But that's not what the West wants. That's not what America, that's not what Britain and France want. So we have to compromise. And our compromise that you have to know is that we're going to divide Germany. And Germany is going to be divided up into 4 parts. America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union will all control a part of Germany. But the true sticky point will be the capital, Berlin. The capital of Berlin, which has 2.5 million people, is in the Russian-controlled part. But it, too, is broken up into 4 parts, controlled by America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. So you have West Berlin, the city, is behind. Let's see if we can look at the map here. So see, here's our problem. We're going to combine ours, America, France, and Britain. We're just going to say after a while, we're going to, it's just easier if we just combine this into West Germany. That'd be fine. The Soviet Union has this part right here. Here's their buffer zone. All right, all these countries here. Here's the Soviet Union. But look at Berlin, way behind enemy lines. Oops. Way behind enemy lines, and the capital itself is divided. So this part, West Berlin, is going to get American money, and it's going to grow rich, and it's going to grow very nice. And people from East Berlin are going to start moving there because they see that these people have jobs and they live in nice homes now, whereas they don't have anything. That looks bad if you're trying to tell the world that communism is better than capitalism. So what we were doing, we were driving in through Russia-controlled territory into Berlin to supply. Joseph Stalin's going to put a stop to that. He puts up barriers and stops us from supplying West Berlin. He wants West Berlin basically to fall. So that puts us in a position. Rather than risk war, Harry Truman decides that he's going to do the Berlin airlift, another very important thing you need to know, and it's very simple to remember. We are going to send airplanes over the top to land in West Berlin airports with food and fuel for the West Berliners. We do this for 11 months. An airplane is landing every 2 minutes for 11 months. It's very impressive. America will do this with the help of Britain as well. And it really kind of makes Stalin look bad. So after 11 months, he is going to just very quietly lift the blockade, and we're going to go back to supplying West Berlin over land. Now, the difference between a Cold War and a hot war, World War II was a hot war. The combatants were actively fighting each other. In a Cold War, we're talking smack to each other. We are saying bad things about the Soviet Union. They are saying bad things about us. We're trying to get friends to say bad things about them. They're trying to get their friends to say bad things about us. But we are not fighting them. We never directly fight the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We're going to have countries as proxies. We're going to have countries fight on our behalves. We're going to supply troops. We're going to send a lot of money, but we never actively fight against each other. Now, when you see these, if it's in the East, and usually if a country has to say democratic or a republic in it, it means that it's communist. It's like the opposite. It's like calling a large guy tiny. Okay, the People's Republic of China is the official name of China. It's not capitalist, or it's not a democracy. It's communist. So all of these are communist countries. So as time goes by, 3.5 million East Germans end up fleeing to the West. And again, Stalin doesn't like this. It makes it look bad. The younger ones, the highly skilled workers, they know the money's better, that life is better, standard of living is better. So in 1961, overnight, Stalin's going to have the Berlin Wall constructed. Actually, I apologize. It's not Stalin. It's his successor, Khrushchev, that does that. And it becomes the symbol of the Cold War. Literally, families are separated overnight. There are machine guns set up, and there are people who die trying to cross the Berlin Wall. Now, in 1949, another huge blow to America is the loss of China to communism. Remember that China had been in a very long, protracted civil war. They had taken a time out when the Japanese attacked them. And as soon as World War II is over, they go back to figuring out who's going to run their country. Well, Jishi, also known as Kai-shek, he loses. He's the nationalist forces backed by America. We give him money, and he loses. The communists win China. So he is going to leave. He's going to run away to Taiwan with most of China's gold reserves, and he's going to call Taiwan, this small island off the coast of China, he's going to call it China. Meanwhile, the victors, the communists under Mao Zedong, they're going to proclaim the rest of China the People's Republic of China, and it's the real China. America will recognize Taiwan as China, which is a big reason that we have poor relationship with China. And China is going to undergo this dramatic transformation where the peasants are going to get the land from the wealthy landowners that is going to be dispersed amongst them. But communism isn't really going to treat China that good. And Mao Zedong is going to be responsible for more deaths than either Stalin or Hitler. Both China and the Soviet Union felt very threatened by the United States' actions. China feels threatened because America's rebuilding Japan, the enemy that invaded them and did terrible things to them. So even though we smoke Japan and we grind them into powder basically with our bombings and the 2 atomic bombs, we occupy them for several years and we give them a lot of money and rebuild their stuff that was destroyed in the war. We want them to be a check on communism. We don't want them to fall to communism. And so China does see that as a threat. And really the relationship, too, between China and the Soviet Union never becomes very good. In the beginning, China accepts Soviet Union's money, but as the years go on and China gets on its feet a little bit, they don't like being the little brother in the relationship. And the Soviet Union's brand of communism is a little different than Maoist communism. And so thankfully, these two countries don't work very well together, which was good for America and their cause. Now, I told you about a couple of proxy wars. One of those, and the first of those really, is the Korean War. Korea had been divided along the 38th parallel after World War II. So you have 2 Koreas. In the north, it's going to be communist. In the south, it's going to be democratic. So as you can see, the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, the PDRK, still what they're known today, they're not democratic. If you have to say it in your name, you're not democratic. So we're going to fight a war. In 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. And so the United States puts together a United Nations action. So unlike the League of Nations that had no response, no strength to it, the United Nations does. It's only 5 years after World War II. So America is about 90% of the UN troops. We land in Korea, and we are able to drive the North Koreans back to the 38th parallel. We will eventually capture their capital. However, the Chinese send a huge force into North Korea to support the North Koreans, and it pushes us back, which makes the commander in the Korean War, Douglas MacArthur, a World War II hero, makes him very angry. He's going to go to Harry Truman and ask for atomic bombs. He wants 50 atomic bombs to annihilate China. Truman will not give him these bombs. He feels that it is too risky because in 1949, just a year prior, in 1949, the Soviet Union had exploded their own atomic bomb. So now it's just too risky. The Soviet Union borders China, its communist friend. He's not going to do that, which makes MacArthur angry, and he becomes insubordinate to Truman, and so Truman's going to have to fire him. All right. So to make a long story short, to summarize the Korean War is that it's going to end where it began, back at the 38th parallel. It is going to be a draw, a stalemate. The Soviet Union and China back North Korea against America and the United Nations, and we get a draw. No peace treaty is signed. There's continued tensions today. Technically, this conflict is still going on. We basically just had a ceasefire, and we have a demilitarized zone. 3 million people were killed in the Korean War. About 40,000 Americans die in the Korean War. A lot of North Koreans die. A lot of Chinese die. Don't forget, our overall American foreign policy is one of containment. So we form another group. Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO, was just the Asian version of NATO. We got China over there. We got to keep an eye on China and North Korea, who are communists. We have the domino theory that comes in under our new president, World War II General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And the domino theory is that when one country falls to communism, it's like a dominoes falling, and the next one is likely to fall, and the next one's likely to fall. And then one day America will be alone against a world of communism. Very scary stuff. So we must contain communism. The Chinese believed the Soviet aid programs were too modest, too many strings attached, so they weren't giving them much money. And when they did, again, it was big brother, baby brother stuff. These two powers are also competing for influence in Africa and Asia. And in 1964, China will become the next country that successfully explodes a nuclear weapon. And so that elevates their prestige, and they want to shake off the little baby brother stuff. Things get worse during the Cold War, for us anyway, when in 1959, the Cubans have a revolution under Fidel Castro, who is going to overthrow Batista, the old leader of Cuba, and he's going to turn to communism. He accepts massive amounts of Soviet aid, and he supports the Soviet Union's foreign policy, so he is an enemy to the United States. This is the only country in the Western Hemisphere that has communism. America sees it as very much as a threat. And so under the next American president, JFK, John F. Kennedy, him and the CIA are going to send 1,500 Cubans who had escaped to America, because many Cubans basically jumped into the ocean on rafts and stuff to make it to America to escape communism. But they want to free their country and they want to free their families back home. So we do this under the table thing where we train these Cubans, these 1,500 Cubans. We send them into the Bay of Pigs there in Cuba. And the idea is that they will spur a revolution and they will overthrow Castro. We did not provide them with the air support. And in 3 days, the force is wiped out. They're destroyed because Cuba's backed by the Soviet Union. It's a U.S. embarrassment. It's one that JFK will apologize for. There's Castro there. And then just a few short years later, we're going to end up getting the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is really the closest the world has ever come to nuclear annihilation. Our spy planes discovered in 1962 that the Soviets were building missile silos. They were building, they had nuclear warheads on Cuba. Kennedy publicly challenges the Soviet Union. He ends up quarantining, he calls it quarantining Cuba, because blockading Cuba would be an act of war. And if he blockades Cuba, then the Soviet or America and NATO will be at war with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. So instead, he words it differently, and he's quarantining Cuba. America's ships surround the island, and what are they going to do when Soviet ships, which are bringing goods, supplies, and nuclear weapons to Cuba, what are we going to do when they show up? Will there be shots fired? And the whole world basically holds its breath for 13 days during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets do end up conceding, but there was an incident not widely known at the time where there was a Soviet sub underwater and an American ship dropped depth charges to signal it to communicate with them. Well, the nuclear sub felt that they were being attacked. And it took the captain, the first mate, and like a science officer. If all three voted to fire a nuclear torpedo, then they were going to. And two of the three said yes. And then the first mate said no. And that was enough to not fire the nuclear warhead and really averted, because we would have retaliated, of course. And then this mess would have gotten out of hand. So we came really close. In the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets will end up taking their missiles out of Cuba, but only if America guarantees non-interference with the Castro regime. That's the public thing. Privately, America also agrees to take missiles, their own nuclear missiles, out of Turkey and Italy, which were pointed at the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union does get something out of this. Now, thankfully, things cool off just a little bit in the 70s, and we get something called détente. You need to know détente. It was a reduction in hostility between the nuclear superpowers. Thank goodness. Some of the things that come out of that were the strategic arms limitations talk, or SALT. There was a SALT 1 and a SALT 2. You need to know that the next American, well, not the next American president, because LBJ was after Kennedy, but President Richard Nixon would become the first sitting president to visit communist-controlled China, and that helped lessen tensions with China. We kind of opened a dialogue with them. We're opening a dialogue with the Soviet Union. So therefore, a little while, it looked like things were getting better. All right, and that will be the end of the chapter. The next chapter, we're going to talk about the freeing of African and Asian colonies. And we'll eventually talk about the revamping of the Cold War in the 1980s as well. Okay, so with this one, most of the headings, very important. There's a lot of vocabulary words in this one that you need to know. Okay, thank you guys. We'll see you in class.